Welcome to this webinar, everyone. Let me take an opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Rob Small. I'm the National Disability Training and Consultancy Manager at Maximus's Health Division. I'm a qualified L&D professional and have over 15 years experience in the delivery of consultancy and training-based services to both internal and external clients. For those of you that aren't familiar with Maximus, we employ 5,000 highly trained colleagues to deliver services across 285 sites. We specialise in assessments, health, employability and connect services to a range of government and private sector clients. So just a quick disclaimer for today's webinar, that it's important to note that we fully appreciate the topic of suicide can be an emotive one. If you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts, or you feel you would like to talk to someone following today's session, we will of course be providing you with information and guidance on how best to approach this. If you feel during the session that the topics discussed become overwhelming, then we fully understand if you feel the need to drop out of the session at that time. A recording of today's session, along with guidance of support mechanisms available, will be sent out to you all following today's webinar. So the webinar today will explore how a proactive and preventative approach to supporting mental well-being can assist your organisation. I'll introduce you to the topics of suicide, dispelling the myths that exist, as well as highlighting the prevalence and importance of supporting those who may well be at crisis point within your businesses. I'll then hand over to my colleague Barry Norman. He's the operational lead for our disability training and consultancy department. He's responsible for the day-to-day management of all of our delivered services, as well as being a qualified mental health first aid and suicide first aid instructor. He'll be exploring the topic of suicide in a more broader sense and its potential impact to your organisation and those that work within it. And then we'll move on to Kath Wood, who is the product and consultancy lead within our department. Kath's instrumental in the delivery and development of our new and bespoke service solutions and draws on over 25 years experience in working in the field of disability. Kath will take you through a number of key preventative steps and tools that can support those experiencing mental distress or suicidal thoughts within the workplace. As James mentioned, we've got a chance to respond to your questions at the end of today's webinar, so please feel free to submit these to us throughout the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. So firstly, we're going to look at values and attitudes. So when considering the stigma that surrounds the topic of suicide, it's important to look inwardly to your own thoughts and views. What we'd like you to do is to have a read through these statements and to take a moment to consider how you would answer them. So consider, I think suicide is people kill themselves because when I think about suicide, I feel if someone I knew died by suicide, the hardest thing for me would be, as I was growing up, what I learned about suicide was, and what I don't understand about suicide is we would also like you to consider these thoughts throughout this session and when going back into the workplace. By challenging your own misconceptions and beliefs surrounding those who may be experiencing suicidal thoughts, perhaps those from when you were growing up, it will aid you in ensuring any approach you take to supporting someone comes from a non-judgmental space. By also recognizing that you do not need to fully understand the thoughts and feelings that someone is experiencing to enable you to actively listen to them and provide information and guidance on where to seek professional support is also a great first step. We're now going to explore the prevalence of those who may be experiencing some form of suicidal thoughts. And here are some shocking and sobering statistics. So according to an NHS digital report in 2014, among the general population, 1 in 5 people have had suicidal thoughts at some time. 1 in 14 have engaged in self-harm, and 1 in 15 have attempted suicide. In 2020, more than 17 people per day took their life, and these are just the reported suicides. So what else do we know? Well, we know that a lot of suicides go unreported. A Forward for Life presentation suggests that between 5 to 25% more suicides occur each year that are not reported. The Mental Health Foundation's Men and Mental Health report states that suicide is the leading cause of death in men aged under 45. the suicide rate for men is around 3 times that for women, and males aged 45 to 49 continue to have the highest suicide rates. So now we're going to look at some myths and dispelling the most common ones. So myth number 1 is people who talk about suicide aren't serious and won't actually do it. People who attempt or complete suicide have often told someone that they can't go on or life isn't worth living, and some will have actually told someone that they want to die. If we ignore these signs, then we run the risk that they might be serious and we could have helped them. Number 2 is people who say they're going to do it are just attention seeking. Anyone who says they want to end their lives should always be taken seriously. It may well be that they want our attention, not to show off, but to call out for help. For someone to talk about suicide, they must be really struggling to cope. And if we're able to help them to get support, it could save their lives. Number 3 is people who feel suicidal want to die. Many people who feel suicidal do not actually want to die. They just don't want to carry on living their life and cannot see another way out. This highlights how important a conversation around other options and support is so vital. Number 4 is talking or asking about suicide can make someone want to do it. We know that suicide can be a taboo topic. It's difficult for us to talk about, and often the person doesn't want to burden anyone with how they're feeling. If we ask someone directly about suicide, it gives them permission or an opportunity to talk about it, and it tells us how serious the situation actually is. If we can get people talking, we can help guide them to support and to help them see another way out of how they're feeling. If we don't talk about or ask about suicide, we may miss the opportunity to intervene. And the final one is, if they're serious about suicide, then there's nothing we can do. So feeling actively suicidal can be temporary, even if someone has been feeling low, anxious, or struggling to cope for a long period of time. A simple conversation showing that someone cares and being able to guide them to support can make a difference. But it is important to note that some people will go on to attempt or complete suicide, whatever we do. We can only try our best to help. So what does this all tell us? Well, it tells us that every single one of us can have an impact on preventing suicide. So now I'm going to hand you over to Barry to explore the history of suicide, dive deeper into the language that we use, the stigma that still very much exists around the taboo subject of suicide, and the hidden toll. So welcome, Barry, and over to you.
Thank you, Rob. A fantastic start to the webinar so far. So I want to talk to you about the history, the language, and in particular the stigma that is present around suicide. Nowadays, it would seem almost unthinkable to punish someone for attempting suicide. But until just over half a century ago, it was a crime in England and Wales. When suicide was a crime, it used to be called self-murder. It became a crime under common law in England in the mid-13th century, but long before that, it was condemned as a mortal sin in the eyes of the church. So for a death to be declared fellow de se, which is Latin for felon of himself, an old legal term for suicide, it had to be proved the person was sane. Now, if this was proven, they would be denied a Christian burial and instead just carried to the crossroads in the dead of a night and often dumped in a pit. There was no clergy, no mourners, no prayers were offered. As sorrowing as this was, punishment didn't end with death. The deceased family would all be stripped of their belongings and handed to the crown as an additional form of punishment. And this continued to be the case up until about 1822. So fast forward 130 years or so, with self-murder still being a crime, it was documented by a Times leader on the subject noted that in 1956, there were 5,387 failed suicide attempts known to the police. And of those, 613 were actually prosecuted. Most were discharged, fined, or put on probation, but 33 of them were actually sent to prison. It wasn't until 1958 the British Medical Association and the Magistrates Association urged for a more compassionate and merciful outlook. And a year later, the Church of England finally joined the calls for change. So with the combined efforts of several MPs, the British Medical Association, the Magistrates Association, and prominent tabloids at the time, the law eventually changed on the 3rd of August 1961, introducing the Suicide Act, which decriminalised the act of suicide in England and Wales, so that those who did suicide behaviour and lived would no longer be prosecuted. So I want to move on to language and stigma, and noting that words do matter. So suicidal deaths and suicidal behaviour and deaths are highly stigmatised, as we know. Destigmatising suicide is our responsibility, and the language which we choose to use can either increase or reduce stigma. The phrase commit suicide carries that negative connotations as it originates from the historical treatment of suicide as a criminal act, as previously mentioned. But using mental health language sensitively at all times shows a baseline of respect. Certain language sensationalizes mental illness and reinforces that stigma. Certain terminology can also suggest a lack of quality of life for people with mental illness, and labeling a person by their mental health illness reduces someone's identity to their own illness. People first language shows respect for the individual and reinforces the fact that their condition does not define them. How we speak about mental health might influence the way our friends, family, work colleagues speak about the subject within their own circles. So I want to talk about the hidden death toll and the ripple effect. So first and foremost, the hidden toll. This is a hidden toll attached to a suicide, and the hidden toll has 3 dimensions. So you've got the gravestone itself, and this represents someone who's not here today, someone who has died, and the cause of death was suicide. The depth of the gravestone represents the people who are still here today, but who have attempted suicide. So they've done suicide behaviour, and they live with that harm. And the 3rd dimension is the shadow. This represents all the people who are left behind. It is estimated that for every person who dies by suicide, on average, about 15 people are emotionally injured because of that sudden traumatic loss. Losing someone close by suicide likely changes that person forever. It's likely that person will never be the same again. There was some research done in Australia in 2015 that estimated that for every person who dies by suicide within a community, 134 people are significantly affected by that loss. Many more may be impacted, but not significantly. So this figure does resonate within the workplace, thinking about how close work relationships can be within the team, within the department, or the company itself. So those 15 people who are emotionally injured from bereavement by suicide that I've just mentioned, the ones who are emotionally injured by the loss, evidence suggests that some 60% of people directly affected by suicide loss, people bereaved by suicide, may go on to experience suicidal thoughts themselves. So I want to provide another model, and this one is the ripple effect of suicide. So based in the UK in 2020, with a population of just over 66.22 million people, give or take, there was 6,221 reported suicides. So Rob mentioned reported suicides earlier on in his statistics. So what is a reported suicide? Well, a reported suicide is when there's been a sudden death. The coroner, supported from the police, medical records and family, reports that investigation. And through sufficient evidence to establish on the balance of probability that the person who did suicide behaviour died with the intention of taking their own life. So these are just the reported suicides. What else do we know? Well, a lot of suicides go unreported. 5 to 25% more suicides occur each year. That's not even reported. But the positive news is that most people who do suicide behaviour, so this is behave in a way that might result in their death, will actually live. And that's something we need to hold on, and that's something we need to remember. It's also estimated that 40 to 100 times the number of people who die by suicide will make a suicide attempt and actually live. So that is non-fatal suicide behaviour. So by comparison to the number of people practicing suicide behaviour and the actual conclusion of death by suicide is a comparatively rare event. So what about the number of people who are thinking about suicide? The Samaritans in the Office for National Statistics estimate between 3.5% to 5% of us are actually thinking about suicide at any given time. So that's 1 in 20 of us right now could be thinking of suicide. And there's over 80 people on the attendee list now. So tie this information in with Australian research, which told us that estimated 15 people are emotionally injured by each suicide and 134 people are directly affected. We 100% have to think about this in relation to the workplace. Think about your own workplace, your own team, your own department, the company where you work. 1 in 20 could be thinking about suicide. So this alone is a business case for the need to upskill the workforce in awareness, prevention and support, not just with suicide, but mental health entirely. So I'm going to hand over to Kath now, who will guide you through supportive tools and tips for suicide prevention at work.
Thanks, Barry. And as you said, suicide intervention itself is very important, and we will cover this later on. But actually, we really want to go a step backwards and actually get to the point of prevention, preventing somebody even getting to the point of contemplating suicide. So we need to ensure that we're supporting employees' mental health and providing plenty of opportunity for them to reach out for support before it reaches a crisis point. So we've already seen some statistics which are quite sobering around the topic of suicide, but here are a few more about the wider topic of mental health, which shows the prevalence, impact and cost of poor mental health, both in wider society and also in the workplace. According to NHS Digital in their report in April 2021, 3.26 million people in the UK were in contact with mental health services. In October 2021, the Office for National Statistics reported that the prevalence of moderate or severe depressive symptoms amongst adults in Great Britain during the summer of 2021 was 17%. And a report from the Mental Health Foundation in March this year estimated that the mental health problems cost the UK economy £117.9 billion each year. So it's clear that poor mental health is a UK-wide issue which we cannot ignore. Mental health is also having an increasing impact in the workplace too. The Health and Safety Executive produced a report around the UK in 2021. They said that 822,000 workers were estimated to be affected by work-related stress, depression or anxiety. And 50% of all work-related ill health was linked to work-related stress, depression and anxiety. And a Deloitte report in January 2020 estimated that the annual cost of mental ill health to UK businesses is £45 billion. So not only will developing a mental health strategy help you support employees' mental health and prevent suicide, it will also reduce the impact of mental health across your business too. So let's start at the beginning by looking at what you already know or don't know about the prevalence, impact and cost of mental ill health in your business. This will tell you the scale of the issue and help you to see improvements as you implement the strategy. So do you know how many people in your business have disclosed a mental health condition? This could have been disclosed during recruitment, whilst employed, or following an absence through sickness. Does your HR system allow you to record this? And how accurate do you really think this information is? Can you assess what absence through mental ill health costs you? This could be in sick pay, overtime payments, or even paying temporary workers. What effect does this have on your productivity? It's harder to measure, but we should also consider presenteeism. This is when somebody is at work doing their full hours, but they cannot perform to their full capacity because of their symptoms. Can you estimate what this might be costing your business? And finally, let's think about leaveism. How many people leave your business due to their mental health? What do your exit interviews say about mental health? And how many people have left your business whilst off sick with mental health symptoms? The Thriving at Work report in 2017 estimated that 300,000 people leave their jobs each year due to their mental health. Those figures we've just heard about mental ill health costing businesses £45 billion a year. This is made up of a combination of both absenteeism, presenteeism and leaveism. So now you have a benchmark of the current situation. It's time then to consider the services and resources that you have in place for employees around the topic of mental health and wellbeing. So, do you have an employee assistance programme in place which staff can call for support with their mental health and other issues they may be having? How can your occupational health service help you around the topic of mental health? What health and wellbeing initiatives do you have in place? Do you provide wellbeing related benefits? What tools can people use to manage their own mental well-being? Do you have a stress risk assessment, a wellness action plan, or a disability passport? And most importantly, are these services and resources well publicised and talked about throughout the company? So apart from your own services and resources, it's important that you take benefit from all of the wonderful external resources provided by specialist organisations. There are charities such as Mind, Calm and Rethink, who provide a wide range of information and also allow people to connect with others who are experiencing similar things. There are helplines provided by Shout, Samaritans and Sane, for example, and these are there in times of crisis. So it's really important that everybody knows that these are available. Wellbeing apps such as Headspace and Insight Timer are really good for helping maintain positive mental well-being, and they're also there to provide guided audio for people to do mindfulness or relaxation. The Hub of Hope helps people to find their local mental health support services, and Every Mind Matters from the NHS is a great source of information and self-help. So now let's think about whether you have the right policies and processes in place to support your employees. It's important to have an anti-bullying and harassment or dignity at work policy so that conflict can be dealt with quickly, as this can be a source of stress. Equality, diversity and inclusion policies help those from protected groups to feel valued, included and protected. Is your sickness absence policy supportive to those experiencing mental health challenges? And does your return to work process support people in their transition back to work after a mental health absence? Do you have safeguarding processes in place, not just for clients or customers, but also for staff too? Does everyone know how to spot when somebody is at risk of harm and know how to report it? And do you have robust safeguarding processes so that managers and safeguarding leads can take action when somebody's at risk? Of course, you can only offer support to people if they feel comfortable talking about it and speaking up. So it's vital that you have a culture where mental health is openly discussed in a positive way. Here are some simple things that you can do. Launch comms campaigns about mental health on a regular basis. Mark awareness days and weeks throughout the year. Create and share case studies of employees who have experienced poor mental health. And release blogs or vlogs where people share their own experiences. And of course, if you can secure senior leadership support for all of your campaigns, this can really help them embed too. And finally, do key staff in your business have the skills, knowledge and confidence needed to support people with their mental health? Are line managers able to spot the signs that someone is struggling? Are they comfortable having conversations about mental health? Do they know where to signpost to? And can they identify and implement workplace adjustments? Do HR colleagues have in-depth knowledge so they can guide and advise the managers? Do you need alternative routes for people to access support, such as mental health first aiders, suicide first aiders, and mental health champions? Not everybody feels comfortable speaking to their line manager about this topic. Do you offer mental health training as part of your staff induction to all staff? Do you offer specific training for line managers and HR professionals? Do you offer it to those who are undergoing stress or who may be at risk? And do you offer it to customer-facing staff so they can support customers who are experiencing poor mental health effectively? And of course, we must consider that training or awareness around the topic of suicide itself is important too, and it will equip individuals with the skills to intervene if they are ever in a situation where somebody is at risk of harm. I'm now going to hand back to my colleague Barry to take you through some high-level guidance in case you yourself are ever faced with that difficult situation.
Thanks, Kath. So we're now going to look at a much broader understanding of workplace statistics, strategic approaches, policies, and signposting. So let's look at what as individuals can do, what to look out for, and also how to respond to someone who is thinking about suicide. I'm going to introduce the idea of spotting these signs and symptoms in relation to our senses, the feelings we sense from others, the things we hear people say, actions we see people do, and things we may learn that has happened or are happening or going to happen in someone's life. So what might we sense a person's feelings? So the bottom right. We live our lives through the feelings of other people. So we might be able to sense that someone is thinking of suicide, that unsettled feeling that something isn't quite right with that person. We might be able to sense that they're feeling worthless or hopeless, but other changes in emotions such as anger, sadness or anxiety can give us some clues too. People thinking of suicide can be feeling a whole manner of emotions, or they could be totally devoid of feeling. Anything like anger, sadness, sorrow, elation, lethargic, or at peace, any feeling, especially one that is out of character for that person. So still using our senses, we'll move from our feelings to our ears. So the top right, what might we hear a person saying? We sometimes express our thoughts either consciously or sometimes unconsciously without even knowing why we're saying it. Might be able to pick up what people are saying, which reveals what they're thinking or actually feeling. Phrases like, no one will miss you when I'm gone, or no one can help me now, or I'm in so much pain, I can't deal with this, I can't take this anymore, I don't know what I'm going to do, soon my problems will be over, you won't have to worry about me for much longer, I won't be a burden. People sometimes do things we can see. So let's move our senses now from our ears to our eyes. So the top left, what might we see a person doing? So maybe tidying up the house, cleaning, putting affairs in order, making amends for past wrongs or wrongdoings, maybe withdrawing or isolation, especially if it's out of character, maybe obtaining the means with which to suicide, maybe self-harming behaviours such as gambling, excess amounts of drinking, using substances, promiscuity, physical self-harm, or wearing maybe inappropriate clothing. Your eyes may also see things that are dangerous, maybe risk-taking behaviour with no real concern for the consequences. So hanging around dangerous places, rooftops, edge of station platforms, or maybe driving very fast or erratically. We also have certain life events and circumstances can also put people under that additional pressure or reduce their ability to cope. Life events affects us all. But what might we learn has happened to that person? So the bottom left, any event that might be so painful to someone, it could lead them to think about taking their own life. Loss and events associated with loss, e.g. redundancy, divorce, bereavement, bankruptcy, repossession of home, maybe arrested for alleged offences, maybe bullying or any sort of abuse, health deterioration or postnatal depression. Before I leave you, I want to provide you with the Suicide Safety Guide, which covers 3 steps. Step number 1. First, they need us to recognise these signs that we've just given out and we've just talked about and ask if they're actually thinking about suicide. You're not asking the person if they want to die or if they want to do something silly or do something stupid. You're purely asking, have you got thoughts of suicide? Remember, thoughts don't mean actions. If it helps you to ask that question, maybe put that question in context, such as sometimes when people are having a relationship breakdown or having issues at work, they start thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? If the answer is yes, then that's something we need to talk about. Step number 2 is listening, learning, and then exploring. That person, they need us to listen to what it feels like for them and what that means for them right now. Only when a person feels we understand them will they be willing to consider any guidance we can offer them moving forward. Once they realise that staying safe is an option, they agree to that, then we can move on to step 3, which is signposting. The most important thing is safety. So they will need help to create a safety plan and connect people with supports. If we have taken the time to listen non-judgmentally and show empathy, then our rapport with that person has started to grow, and therefore they're much more likely to listen to what we encourage, i.e. signposting and staying safe. When the person we are helping realizes safety is important, they'll be willing to work with us to stay safe, and to stay safe today, tomorrow, and in the future. However, if there is a need for immediate safety, don't be afraid to call the emergency service on 999 or 112. There are plenty of other options out there, like texting and shout to 85258, the Samaritans, or SANE, or even calling 101 and requesting a safe and well check for an individual. A good proactive starting point which builds good frameworks to support colleagues would always recommend courses like suicide first aid, mental health first aid, to equip your colleagues further. So that's me done. Back to yourself then, James.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. As a reminder, if you have a question to ask us, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll work through these now. We have received a couple of questions asking if there will be a copy of the recording after the event. Absolutely, this webinar is being recorded and details of this will be sent out as soon as they become available. Our next question we have is, we lost a colleague recently from death by suicide. What are the first steps I should take as a manager to support my team?
I'm happy to take that one, James. So first of all, my sincere condolences. It's never an easy time, especially when there is suicide involved. But yeah, the one thing I would recommend and advise is reaching out to support services within the organisation. Have a look what support there is within the organisation, like the EAP, occupational health, for example. Other questions like, has the organisation got mental health first aiders or suicide first aiders within the organisation to support with the post-vention piece as well? Kath mentioned a fantastic resource earlier on, the Hub of Hope, that narrow downs and hones in support networks within your local area. So you can go on the Hub of Hope, enable location services, or type in your postcode, and that will bring up the local support networks in your local area. But you can also filter by different concerns as well, and bereavement support is one of them. But I think one of the other main things I would also think about is that the manager will need support as well. It's not just the manager's role just to know everything and support everyone. The manager will need support as well, because you can't pour from an empty cup.
Perfect. Thank you, Barry. Next question we have is, what can you do if you know someone is struggling with their mental health but keeps telling you they are fine?
I'm happy to take that one. Thanks, James. So it's very key that it's a difficult conversation to have for both of you to do it and also for them. So actually what I would say is to persist and still make sure that you regularly check in with that person. You know, nobody is going, you can't force anybody to talk about their mental ill health. You can't force them to talk or share their symptoms or their concerns, but it's really important that you keep checking in them with sincerity to show that you really are there should they want to seek that support from you. So I would say keep offering them opportunities, and also publicising the other routes to support. So they may feel uncomfortable talking about it with you as their manager or a work colleague, but maybe make sure that you signpost them to mental health support services, maybe the mental health first aiders that within the business, or mental health champion if you have them, or actually direct some of the outside external confidential services such as employee assistance program, or even the access to work mental health support service, where somebody can access that help without disclosing it in the workplace. But ultimately, all you can do is keep putting yourself in the position of asking and being a good listener. And then when people are ready, they will come and talk to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Kath. We've just received another question here. When speaking to upset residents, they may say that they have suicidal thoughts. Is it correct that we should always ask 101 for a safe and well visit to be made, or is it a 999 matter?
So happy to take that one. Ultimately, I guess it's a case of assessing the situation and understanding that individual as to how immediate that need is from that perspective. So 999 naturally is the emergency line number. So if you are of a belief that it is an emergency situation and you're concerned for that person's welfare, should they leave your space or your telephone conversation, depending on how you're engaging with that person, then ultimately 999 would potentially be the call to make. There are other routes in terms of, as Barry mentioned, the 112 service or 101. You can also potentially, if you have this information for that individual, seek support from that individual's GP. They have an obligation to see that individual. So ultimately, I guess you're finding the right route. But I would say in answer to that question, 999 is generally for that emergency situation there and then. You have the other routes that are just as accessible should you have a concern for that person's welfare at that particular moment. But it's making that call. But if you're not sure, then I would say you are welcome to ring 999 if that's the decision you want to make.
I think the only thing I would add there is that it's okay to ask them if they have made a plan or if they've undertaken any action which is unsafe for their well-being. So, that could allow you to make that judgment call as to whether it is an emergency situation. So although it's a difficult conversation to have, to asking, have they actually made a plan, or have they got the means to harm themselves in place, that will tell you if it's an immediate need or if you need to just follow a safeguarding process instead.
Yeah, fully agree.
Thank you all. Next question we have is, we have someone in our business who has been off for a significant period of time now and is experiencing suicidal thoughts. They say they do not feel ready to return to work. What can we do to help them?
Well, I'll take that one to start with, but I'm sure that we'll all have some input onto this one. So I would say, first of all, making it a really important part is keeping in touch. but making sure that you are sensitive to the situation and actually agree and the right method of keeping in touch. So people might feel quite overwhelmed by visits or phone calls. So you might want to put a text or email contact into place to make sure that you still engage with that person. Then, of course, it's making sure that they're in contact with the appropriate services. So are they seeking help through their GP? Do they have access to the employee assistance programme information? Can you put them in the direction of mental health support services so that they can make sure that they are accessing the right support to actually deal with the symptoms they're experiencing? And then it's about thinking about what are the barriers to that return to work. So it might be a difficult conversation, and it's about timing it right to actually think about what is it about the return to work that is triggering those feelings for people, and identifying what you can do to adjust for and remove some of those barriers, and maybe look at a gentle phased return back to the workplace, doing some of the duties which are less problematic for that person as part of that phased return, but remembering to take it at a pace, and you may need to adjust the pace of your normal processes to account for the severity of their symptoms.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself, Kath, in all fairness, in answer to that point. I think the only part I would add to that is ultimately just because someone is experiencing suicidal thoughts, it comes back to, again, that time and place and when it's right for that individual. But echoing what Kath said there, that ultimately that doesn't mean that that person couldn't return to work as part of a phased return and a supportive plan over a period of time that's right for that individual. So it's not expecting a resolution to that there and then, but actually part of work can be really supportive to someone's own mental health and well-being. So working with that individual to find elements, as Kath suggested, that are achievable, or are elements of the role that individual naturally would enjoy, can actually add value and benefit and purposefulness. So definitely kind of entering into those conversations, as challenging as it would be, and choosing the right time and the right place and the right environment for those conversations is definitely key to success as an output over a period of time.
Thank you both. Next question we have is, you mentioned the stress risk assessment resource. Where can I get this?
So it's one of the tools I mentioned in my part, so I'll take this one. So stress risk assessment, so take various forms, and we do have a template that we can share with you, but it allows you to analyse which parts of the job and what elements of work are particularly triggering the stress, allowing you to plan to reduce those triggers. It's also, I would highly recommend having a look at the Health and Safety Executive website, who talk about this in a lot more detail and have a lot more guidance around that risk assessment process. So we're happy to share a resource, but I say look at the HSC website as well.
Thank you, Kath. Next question we have is, I'm a manager. I don't feel confident having these conversations with my team. What advice can you give to me?
Yeah, I think it kind of relates to the previous question that we had around how to approach that conversation with an individual. I guess the other things to consider that I think is important is things like the right time for that conversation to take place, for sure, for both you as a manager of that colleague, but also for the individual. Choosing the right environment, if you have the luxury in this day and age of being in the same working environment as that individual and not working remotely, then choosing the right environment. But again, not necessarily treating it as part of a formal one-to-one conversation as such, or leaving it till that type of performance-based conversation to have it, I think is quite key. But if you are in the same location, taking someone out for a coffee to have a more relaxed conversation, for example, is a good starting point to relax both you and the individual into that type of conversation. But I would also ultimately say, until you have that conversation and you have the outputs of that conversation, you probably aren't going to feel comfortable. It isn't a comfortable conversation for a reason. But I think the reality behind it is to suggest to you that you do go ahead and attempt to have that conversation and open up that dialogue with the individual, regardless of how you're feeling. I think is definitely quite key and important for that type of approach. Kath, Barry, I don't know whether you've got anything you wanted to kind of add context-wise.
I guess from the point of view of the direct conversation, I think you've covered most of the key points really. I mean, I would just encourage you to give it a go. there's very little that you can say that will make the situation worse. If you show genuine concern and you approach it from the point of view of things that you've noticed are different about the person, that could be a good sort of softer way to introduce it. Again, as Rob said, I'd be keen to separate it from any performance reviews or appraisals. So if the conversation comes up around mental health and wellbeing during those, I would kind of separate that conversation. And I think from a general point of view, the more that you generally talk about mental health and wellbeing, the more that you generally put those resources and you publicise them and you talk about things in team meetings, the more that maybe you share your experiences, or you share other stories that you've heard around colleagues in the business who've had their struggles. I think that just shows that there's a genuine interest, and it can actually make that conversation a bit easier because it's a topic that's not so taboo in the workplace.
I think also just supplementary add on from what Kath said in particular, it just adds that drives that culture that it is okay not to be okay. And as Kath said, if we can talk about mental health, how we're feeling and well-being full stop, then conversations further afield, like talking about suicide, talking about mental health in general, will become a lot easier and become the norm rather than become uncomfortable. And if that's one manager experiencing that and in that mindset currently, then likely other managers in the business are probably sharing the same mindset and sharing that same fear.
Thank you, everyone. As a reminder again, just to all attendees, if you do have a question you'd like to submit, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and we'll continue to work through these. The next question we have is, what happens when you are trying to support someone at work, get involved, but then they give up on their life anyway? How do you cope with feeling that you could have done more, or some type of blame guilt for failing them?
I'm happy to start off with this one. Hindsight can be cruel, but also we've got to think about that we are just there for the first aid approach. We're not here to become clinicians or experts in supporting someone. It's about that neighbourhood watch, that initial first aid response, exactly the same as we do with physical first aid. You're not required, you don't have to be there to support that person through to the last and forever onwards. But to get through that feeling, to get through that coping, or to get through that feeling of being able to cope or being able to have done more, I would very much look at the avenues of the EAP, any support networks there are within work. And it's perfectly normal to feel that I could have done a little more, wish I'd done this. Bob, Kath, anything else to add on that potentially?
I would just say it's a normal reaction to feel that way, no matter how much effort you've put in. Going back to that hidden toll and the ripple effect, we know that it's going to have an impact on people around them. So it's a normal reaction to feel that way. And again, I would encourage you to seek some support to work through that. But all you can do is offer guidance, advice, signpost, and offer support. At the end, the person makes their own personal choice. But I say I would encourage you to just talk that through with somebody. I think that's an important part of the grieving process as much as anything.
Perfect, thank you all. We have now concluded all the questions. However, I'll leave it a couple of moments just in case anyone else would like to submit any more. Just again, as a reminder, we will share a recording of this webinar as soon as it's available, and more information.
James, I just wanted to draw your attention to a chat message we've had around the topic of confidentiality. So I think it might be something we might want to quickly address. So we've had a comment around should we be mindful of confidentiality? And I guess obviously we should respect people's confidentiality, unless of course there is a severe risk to their health and well-being. And that's where our safeguarding processes would say that we would act in their best interests, not secretly. We would tell them that we are contacting emergency services, but actually not keeping that information to ourselves. If that person then needs to access that support, we should act in their best interest and contact that professional support. But it's a good point raised, and thank you for raising it.
Absolutely. Well, I think that concludes all of the questions. If there are no more to be submitted, just want to say thank you for attending today, everyone. We hope it has been useful. As I mentioned earlier, we will share a recording of this webinar when available. But if you do have any questions, please email us at workplacehealth@maximusuk.co.uk and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.